The origins of this presentation lie with Brian Fuller, whose dedication and inspiration in the development of the Grendon Village Archive and regular reading of the eulogies to those members of our village who lost their lives in the 2 World Wars became part of our embedded memories of our lives here. It is to his memory that I dedicate this tale. I would like to talk to you about ships of war, the homes of those who gave their lives for our freedom today. To borrow loosely from the words of Nicholas Montserrat, this is a story of the oceans. The heroes are the men and the heroines are the ships. The only villain is the sea, the cruel sea, which man has made more cruel. I've long wanted to find out more about the naval servicemen we hear a small snippet about every Remembrance Sunday. This has led us to look into their service histories, focusing on the background and story behind the ships in which they served. The documents we have located have expanded the number of vessels well beyond those we hear about every year. We have 3 naval personnel on our memorial and on the plaques to your left. So let us look at each of them in turn. As you will hear, all 3 of our heroes lost their lives while on convoy duty, protecting great fleets of merchant ships, bringing in all the essential supplies required to keep Britain and its dominions from starvation, fighting against the perils of U-boats, surface warships, and from aerial attack. Harry Watts is the only professional peacetime Navy man we will be discussing here today. He was born on the 15th of November 1893, the son of Phyllis and William Watts, that were living in Grendon Underwood at the time of the 1901 census. By 1911, his parents were living near Woodham, before moving to Rose Cottage in Kingswood shortly afterwards. I've not managed to trace a picture of him. However, his family are shown standing proudly outside their house in Kingswood here. We can see from Harry's naval service record that he joined the Royal Navy on his 18th birthday in 1911. He was subsequently sent to the training ship HMS Ganges, moored in Shotley in Suffolk. HMS Ganges was a shore establishment based around the former 1863 built armoured frigate HMS Minotaur. This old ship had been stationed as a floating home for 500 boys while they learnt to become seamen. Some of you may recall John Noakes from Blue Peter having to climb up Ganges' training mast back in 1967. The site is now part of a major housing development, and the restoration of Ganges' mast is one of the requirements that has been placed on the developers. After 5 months' training, Harry was assigned as a boy 2nd class to HMS Irresistible, a formidable class battleship under the command of Captain de Clare Foote. This ship, originally built in 1898, was part of the reserve fleet at the time and consigned to harbour duty. She was later to be sunk by a mine during Winston Churchill's troubled Dardanelles and Gallipoli campaign in March 1915. Harry's next ship was HMS King Edward VII, another battleship built in Devonport Dockyard in 1903. He was part of a crew of 777 officers and men serving on board. The ship served in the Channel Fleet, operating out of Portsmouth, protecting our southern shores. His service aboard was again short, and after promotion to boy 1st class, he joined HMS Caesar, an 1895 built battleship. Her station was with the Home Fleet, based in Scapa Flow. Harry's time on board was again short, as the ship was paid off at the end of 1911. With the growing threat of Germany, the main focus of the Royal Navy was at this time shifting from the Channel towards the North Sea. In late October, Harry returned to the shore establishment, HMS Vivid in Devonport, where he would have studied seamanship, signalling and telegraphy, and may well have had some shore leave, as Vivid was also used as a catch-all for servicemen not assigned to a specific vessel at the time. This would have been followed by a short month-long stint on the cruiser HMS Royal Arthur, which had been built in Portsmouth back in 1891. She was stationed with the Home Fleet in Scapa Flow and was at that time under the command of Captain Charles Miller. Harry successfully gained his promotion to ordinary seaman in November 1911. His next station was on board the Monmouth-class cruiser HMS Kent under Captain Thomas Hunt. We see him joining on the 23rd of December 1911. This would have been Harry's first overseas assignment at the height of the British Empire. The Kent was based in the Far East, where she served in the China Station, operating out of Singapore and Hong Kong. In January 1913, Harry was still on board and received his promotion to able seaman. The vessel returns home and underwent a major refit at the end of 1913, and Harry signs off in December to return to HMS Vivid for a further months-long period of leave. We shall leave Harry for a moment and say a little bit more about HMS Kent. After she completed her refit in October 1914, she sailed under the command of Captain John Allen to the South Atlantic to strengthen the British squadron down there. However, the ship did not arrive in time to save the British from the ignominy of defeat at the Battle of Coronel in November 1914. Nevertheless, the ship arrived just in time to restore British morale by taking a creditable role in the Battle of Falklands, joining the fleet under the command of Admiral Doveton Sturdy on board his flagship, the battle cruiser HMS Invincible. This famous ship would later be lost at the Battle of Jutland. On the 4th of December 1914, the Kent headed out into battle. The ship's surgeon on board published a wonderfully titled book about the action, called "The Enemy Fought Splendidly." I find it somewhat surprising that this somewhat chivalrous and possibly misguided view of warfare still seems to have persisted some 4 months into the Great War, or the war to end all wars. After sighting the enemy off Port Stanley, Sturdy ordered his fleet to sea. Kent was in the midst of refuelling, and hence was short of coal for the forthcoming battle. Nevertheless, all of the fleet proceeded to sea in a general chase of the enemy, who had not expected to meet with such a powerful British force. While the flagship focused on destroying the German flagship Scharnhorst and the supporting cruiser Gneisenau, the Kent followed the Nürburg out of the line of battle as the German fleet scattered. The Kent closed the range on the converging course, and the distance between the two cruisers dropped to just 3,000 yards. By that time, Kent's 6-inch shells were causing major damage to the German ship. A serious fire broke out on the Nürburg, and after another half an hour of shelling, she was dead in the water and had ceased firing. The Nürburg finally struck her colours before rolling over and sinking, and the Kent's crew quickly lowered lifeboats to pick up survivors. Only 12 men were rescued. 327 officers and men lost their lives. On board the Kent, she had been hit by 38 shells, but they were largely ineffective against her armoured hull. You can see some of the damage here, with the most humorous shot being the shell that hit the officer's wardroom washroom. Nevertheless, we should not forget that the Kent still suffered 6 crewmen killed and 8 seriously wounded during the battle. For the family of German Admiral Max Graf von Spee, the battle was particularly tragic. Not only was his own life lost as Scharnhorst sank, but that of his son Heinrich, who died aboard the Gneisenau, and his youngest son, Otto, who went down with the Nuremberg. After this battle, Kent rejoined Sturdy's fleet to hunt down the escaping HMS Dresden, which was the sole German survivor from the battle. Kent is credited with being the first to spot her on the 14th of March 1915, anchored in Cumberland Bay on Juan Fernandez Island, most famously known as Robinson Crusoe's Island. Cornered and unwilling to surrender the ship, the German captain scuttled her. Returning to Harry, after his promotion to able seaman, he spends August and September 1913 back in Plymouth at HMS Vivid, before being drafted to join HMS Blake under the command of Captain Warren Doyley. The Blake was an 1889 built cruiser that had been constructed at Chatham. Her active career had proved short, as she had suffered a boiler explosion off the Lizard in Cornwall in 1896. After being laid up for a number of years, the ship was then repurposed as a depot ship in 1908. Her role after November 1911 was to serve as the base for the second destroyer flotilla in the North Sea. Harry Watts was therefore consigned to harbour duty throughout the early part of the First World War. However, that was about to change, as on the 7th of September 1915 he was assigned to the brand new M-class destroyer HMS Marmion. You can see the Admiralty plans for one of her sister ships here. Marmion was built at Swan Hunter shipyard and delivered in September 1915. Of 1,029 tons and armed with 3 4-inch guns and torpedo tubes, the ship was very fast, capable of 34 knots. Marmion served under the 11th Destroyer Flotilla and had a crew of 77 men. Harry's first captain was Commander William Leveson Gower, the 4th Earl of Granville, and future uncle to Queen Elizabeth II. During his time under the Earl's command, Harry was largely involved in convoy duty. This included, on the 14th of April 1917, escorting the RMS Olympic on troop-carrying duty. She was, of course, the sister ship to the Titanic, which had tragically sunk exactly 5 years earlier. For some reason, the Marmion missed the Battle of Jutland, in which the rest of her flotilla did take part, and in May 1917 her captain left the ship due to poor health. He was relieved by another destroyer captain, Lieutenant Commander Herbert Lyon. The latter had recently commanded the destroyer Nonsuch at the Battle of Jutland. On the 20th of October, the ship was moored in Lerwick, when she was hurriedly called up to replace another escort vessel which had fouled her propellers in some wire netting. Marmion had to raise steam and leave at high speed to try and catch up with the convoy, which had already left the port bound for Bergen in Norway. During the night of the 21st of October, Marmion was still rushing to catch up, travelling at 16 knots, in the dark and with reduced visibility, when she suddenly came across the path of the convoy travelling in the opposite direction, heading from Bergen back to Lerwick. The Marmion crossed the path of the escorting destroyer HMS Tirade at 1:30 in the morning. Despite trying to take last-minute evading action, Marmion was struck amidships and cut in half. The entire ship's company of 77 men, including Harry and the ship's captain, were lost. The collision was just an unfortunate accident. In the days before radar and GPS navigation, and with ships travelling without showing any navigational lights, in reduced visibility and at high speed in the dark, such accidents were bound to occur. That it happened on Trafalgar Day, as the war at sea was already past its peak, is just another tragedy of war. We now move on to the Second World War, and our second young hero, John Sidney Wynne. John was born on the 1st of May 1917 in Aylesbury. He was the son of Reverend Sidney Wynne, who was Grendon's vicar from 1914 all the way through to 1955. John's mum was the vicar's wife, Dorothy. He was their only son and the brother of Daphne. The rectory next door was, of course, his childhood home. At the start of the war, John signed up for the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserves at the Bristol-based 7 Division training station based on board HMS Flying Fox, a 1918-built sloop that was moored in Pembroke Dock. She had been in the city since 1921 and was to remain there until being towed away and broken up for scrap in Cardiff in 1973. The RNVR was predominantly the route into the Navy for keen yachtsmen, bank clerks and lawyers. Most would be destined to become junior officers if they passed the training course as part of the Wavy Navy. After signing on in Bristol, John would have been sent for training at HMS King Alfred, a stone-based frigate based at Hove, under the command of Captain John Noel Perry. This was the base used for the RNVR officer training. The course was broken into 3 phases and began with 2 weeks basic training at Mowden School under Commander Richards, a retired sea officer. This was followed by 6 weeks at Lancing College, learning basic navigation, seamanship and signalling. This period was under the control of Commander Hugh McLean. After passing this phase, successful candidates would be moved on to Hove for the final 4-week phase. This saw the cadets being billeted in an underground car park. It would appear that John did not pass the final interview board to become a commissioned officer. However, he is assigned as a signalman to join HMS Repulse. Repulse was a late First World War battlecruiser. A battlecruiser was faster than our battleships and was armed with the same high-caliber 15-inch main armament. However, their weakness was in a lack of armour. Built at John Brown's shipyard in 1916, you can see Repulse's plans here, together with some photographs from the build of the ship. She was the sister ship of HMS Renown. She had a crew of 967 men during peacetime, rising to over 1,200 during the war. Repulse was one of the favourite ships in the fleet. She was very fast and very elegant for a killing machine. During the interwar years, she had been used as a promotional ship, travelling with other fleet favourite HMS Hood on a world tour. In 1939, she was used by King George VI and Queen Elizabeth to travel to Canada. The ship spent the first months of the Second World War hunting for German raiders and blockade runners in the North Atlantic as part of the Home Fleet. In October 1939, she was transferred to Halifax, operating on convoy protection with the aircraft carrier HMS Furious. She participated in the Norwegian campaign of April to June 1940 and searched for the German battleship Bismarck in May 1941. This would have been an intense introduction to the Navy for John. However, for all the frenetic activity, including the ship being badly damaged in a storm while chasing the Scharnhorst in the Atlantic, the ship did not see any action during John's time on board. On the 19th of July 1941, the ship entered Rosyth dockyard for a refit. John seems to have left the ship at around this time. John is then moved across to join a new ship, HMS Audacity. The Audacity started her life as a German merchant ship named the SS Hanover. The Hanover was a 5,537 gross ton ship built at Bremer Vulcan shipyard, and she entered service in 1939. while attempting to return as a blockade runner to Germany from the West Indies in the early months of the war, she was sighted and ordered to stop on the night of the 7th and 8th of March 1940 by the light cruiser HMS Dunedin and the Canadian destroyer HMCS Assiniboine. The order was ignored, and the Hanover unsuccessfully attempted to escape. When it became clear that she could not get away, the captain instructed the seacocks be opened and the ship set on fire. Nevertheless, a boarding party from the Dunedin successfully captured her and bravely closed the valves and fought the fire. Once secured, the prize was towed to Jamaica. She was briefly named Sinbad upon capture and sent back to Britain, but soon after this she was renamed Empire Audacity. However, owing to growing convoy losses of British merchant ships, a plan was devised to hurriedly convert her into a small escort aircraft carrier to provide aerial protection to the convoys. Her design was unusual, as she had no island to control operations and only had 3 arrestor wires on her short landing platform. Blythe Shipbuilding Limited in Northumberland undertook the conversion, which was completed in time for commissioning on the 20th of June 1941. We expect it was around this time that Johns joins the ship as her signalman. After working up, she sailed with her first convoy, OG-74, to Gibraltar in September 1941. She was equipped with 6 martlets from 802 Squadron. On the 21st of September, during her first run, one of her aircraft shot down a Condor bomber. This trip was followed by a return convoy to the UK, before returning again to Gibraltar on November 11th, 1941. On December the 14th, Audacity sailed once again as part of the 36th Escort Group to cover convoy HG-76. The convoy was very important and was given a heavy escort to protect it. There were 32 merchantmen, and there were to be 11 corvettes and sloops and destroyers, with the Audacity once again providing air cover. During the dawn patrol on the 17th, one of her aircraft spotted a U-boat on the surface, 22 miles from the convoy, and attacked with machine gun fire, forcing it to submerge. Another was sighted early in the afternoon. The leader of the escorts, the famous Commander Fred Walker, ordered the strong escort detachment to go on the offensive and to hunt down the U-boats. Youth 131 was later attacked using depth charges and gunfire, and the submarine sank by the stern. Early on the 18th, another U-boat, U-434, was detected and forced to surface by depth charges. Again, the crew abandoned ship moments before she rolled over and sank. The next day, U-574 attacked and managed to sink one of the escorts. However, Commander Walker immediately acted and sank her after dropping depth charges. On the 21st of December, about 470 miles west of Cape Finisterre, John's captain, Commander McKendrick, without Fred Walker's, ordered the ship to leave the safety of the convoy and decided to proceed alone on the starboard side, zigzagging at her full speed of 14 knots. At sundown, the encircling U-boat began their next attack on the convoy. A merchantman was struck by a torpedo from U-567 and sank. We now pick up the account of the famous Fleet Air Arm test pilot, Captain Eric Winkle Brown. I was sitting in the wardroom, finishing my after-dinner coffee, when a torpedo hit us right under where our mechanics were working on our martlets. I spilled my coffee in my lap. We rushed on deck. The ship was already down by the stern, with half the gun platform awash and the gun useless. We were about 10 miles away from the convoy. Meanwhile, U-751 was closing in on us. She stopped some little distance from us, and the Germans, for whom this was just too good to be true, worked frantically to reload their torpedo tubes. For about 5 minutes, we simply regarded each other across the water. Then one of our seamen leapt for the Oerlikon and began firing at the U-boat. Our lone gunner had only got off around 2 rounds when we saw the white bubbling tracks of 2 more torpedoes. Everyone rushed for the starboard side of the flight deck. They struck, both in the bows. There was a tremendous explosion, and the whole forward quarter of the ship disappeared. The rest reared up in a split second, so steeply that we could not keep our feet. The martlets plunged down the wildly tilting deck as if in formation, the cries and screams of men being mown down by the monsters mingled with warning shouts. Many leapt off the flight deck into the sea. Going over, I was frightened of landing on someone in the water. The sea seemed thick with heads. I had my leather flying jacket on and my boots over my full uniform. Stuck into the opening of my jacket were 2 things I had given priority to in the scramble to salvage something: my flight logbook and a pair of silk pyjamas I was bringing back for my fiancée. I kicked off my flying boots and tried to blow up my Mae West. I tried to swim away, but found the logbook restricting my movements. Reluctantly, I let it go. At a safe distance, I turned around. The ship was tilted up now at a terrifying angle. Suddenly she lurched further up until she was almost vertical. Then, very quickly, she was gone. It took just 70 minutes for the ship to vanish below the waves. 73 men died along with John Wynne, but 225 survivors were rescued by the other escorts. We should say a little about U-751. She was a Type 7C U-boat built at Kriegsmarine Wharf shipyard in Wilhelmshaven. She was commissioned on the 31st of January 1941 and served with Dönitz's 7th U-boat flotilla. Her commander for her short career was Captain Lieutenant Gerhard Bigolk. U-751 served in 7 patrols and was responsible for sinking 5 merchant ships as well as the Audacity. After the triumphant return to base in Lorient, Bigolk received the Knight's Cross. However, in July 1942, she was attacked with depth charges from a Lancaster from 61 Squadron and a Whitley bomber from 502 Squadron Coastal Defence. Both were operating out of St Evell Air Base in Cornwall. The U-boat sank northwest of Cape Ortegal, with the loss of all 48 crew members. While the loss of Audacity was tragic, as an experimental vessel, the proof of concept was a great success. Her limited squadron of aircraft helped in the destruction of no less than 5 U-boats, for the loss of just 2 merchant ships and 2 of the escorts. This convoy changed the course of naval warfare at sea, and HG-76 was the first convoy to successfully move from being the hunted to the hunter. While Fred Walker's inspired and persistent leadership was instrumental in this, Audacity led the way for future escort carrier development. Our last hero is Joseph Percy Hearn. Born on the 9th of July 1921 in Aylesbury, he grew up in Grendon Underwood, and from this image looks like he had a great childhood. His mother was Anne George, who lived at the old Grendon stores. His father, also called Joseph, was a dairy farmer, according to the census. He had 3 brothers, who you see sat with him here: George, Sidney and Wilfred, with the latter being Pauline's husband. Joseph was working at the Calvert brickyards at the start of the war, and his Navy service record shows him to have been an office clerk. Joseph was called up on the 12th of August 1941 and started his 10-week hostilities-only basic training at the new shore establishment HMS Collingwood in Fareham. His passing out was on the 22nd of October 1941, after which he was assigned to HMS Victory while he awaited his appointment to an operational ship. You can see him sitting here with one of his mates. The Victory appointment would have given him a place to swing his hammock while he awaited his next ship. Victory had been very badly damaged by a German bomb on the 10th of March 1941, so it would not have been a comfortable place to sleep at the time of the ongoing Blitz attacks on the dockyard and city. Joseph's wait was fairly short, as on the 11th of December 1941, just 4 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he joined the ship's company of the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle. Eagle had been built by Armstrong Whitworth during the First World War, originally ordered as a super dreadnought battleship for the Chilean Navy in 1911. Construction had begun in 1913, but was stopped upon the outbreak of war. In February 1918, the partially completed ship was purchased by the Royal Navy, and plans were put in place to convert the ship into an aircraft carrier. While delivered to the Navy in 1919, the ship needed various alterations and redesigns before she became finally operational in 1924 as the largest aircraft carrier in the world at the time, capable of carrying up to 24 aircraft. She had a displacement of 22,200 tons, and her 50,000 horsepower engines could drive the ship at a service speed of 24 knots. Her complement was around 791 men, excluding aircrew. Joseph will have joined the ship in the middle of a refit at Camel Laird shipyard in Birkenhead. The refit had started back on the 1st of November, and this was completed in a hurry due to the urgent need for carriers following the damage to HMS Illustrious and HMS Formidable during the Crete campaign. The rush became even more urgent with the grounding of the brand new carrier HMS Indomitable in the Caribbean, and with the loss of HMS Ark Royal and Audacity. As a result of the rush, Eagle's antiquated power plant was not upgraded, with the refit being focused on strengthening her anti-aircraft defences, replacement of leaking aviation fuel tanks, and installation of improved radar. On Christmas Day, she received orders to sail for 5 weeks, working up with her air arm of Fairey's Swordfish from 813 and 824 Squadron. These torpedo planes were outdated by this time and totally useless against the Luftwaffe and Italian Air Force fighters that were awaiting them. However, a complement of Sea Hurricanes was added for fighter protection. The latter had to be left on deck due to their inability to fit on the ship's antiquated lift system. The ship finally sailed from Birkenhead on the 9th of January 1942. She then proceeded to Gibraltar, escorting convoy WS-16 to join Force H that would operate in the Mediterranean in the battle to save Malta. This squadron consisted of the old Jutland battleship HMS Malaya, the light cruiser HMS Hermione, and 8 destroyers. Eagle's captain, Captain Edmund Rushbrook, had been in command of the ship since April 1941, and hence was already well versed in the old ship's frailty, especially following the rushed refit. It is safe to say that the period from late 1941 through until the summer of 1942 was the Royal Navy's most difficult time, owing to heavy losses being sustained in the global theatres of war, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Far East. Force H was assigned to the Mediterranean, and specifically to the heavy task of saving Malta from falling to the enemy. Between March and April 1942, 3 trips were undertaken, delivering a total of 31 Spitfires. The ship had to run the gauntlet of attacks by German and Italian U-boats and the Luftwaffe and Italian Air Force bombers, as well as to avoid the threat of Italian naval units. The strain on the ageing ship was immense, and her steering and engines needed substantial repairs between the trips. In May, the ship joined forces with the American carrier USS Wasp for Operation Bowery, delivering a further 17 Spitfires and 6 Fairey Albacores. The ship's antiquity is highlighted by Wasp's ability to carry no less than 47 Spitfires during the same trip. The planes were flown off, unarmed, and fitted with long-range fuel tanks. Cigarettes and food would be packed into the planes to alleviate some of the suffering on the island. June and July saw a further 4 trips. These would be Eagle's last plane delivery runs. She had successfully delivered 172 Spitfires to secure the aerial defence of Malta. Without these successful deliveries of aircraft, the island, which was suffering from heavier bombing than London had faced during the worst days of the Blitz, would certainly have fallen. However, by now, Malta was facing starvation due to the failure of cargo ships to arrive during convoys in April and June. As a result, it became imperative to push through a major supply convoy to the island. Eagle therefore took back on board her 14 Sea Hurricanes to act as an air wing to protect the convoy from air attack. Plans were put in place to gather one of the most important convoys of the war, WS-21S, more commonly known as Operation Pedestal. Eagle was joined by 3 more aircraft carriers, HMS Furious, Victorious, and Indomitable. 2 battleships, HMS Nelson and Rodney, 7 light cruisers, and 26 destroyers, all to escort a fleet of just 13 freighters and 1 oil tanker, the famous Ohio. The fleet left Gibraltar on the 10th of August 1942. Eagle's fate was quickly sealed the very next day when the U-boat broke through a destroyer screen. The young telegraphist aboard the ship appears to have suspected something was not right. Sadly, his concerns were not taken seriously. U-73, under the command of Helmut Rosenbaum, fired 4 torpedoes at Eagle. The old ship was hit and quickly listed to port. We have the account of a survivor from the ship's engine room, Lieutenant Derek Walling. He was serving as an engine room artificer. He writes, "I was checking electrical distribution boxes in the port wing engine room when we were torpedoed and sunk, and I consider my escape to be nothing short of miraculous. We were being tracked by enemy submarines, and the Eagle was the first ship to be torpedoed. She went down in 8 minutes. I spent all 8 minutes trying to escape before the ship sank, and I was only 50 yards away when she turned over. After helping about 6 shipmates to reach an open hatch from which the ladder had fallen, by allowing them to climb up on my back, I was left trapped inside the ship. I could not see anything because it was pitch black, and I had to feel my way around in the smoke. I was close to giving up. It seemed impossible. Then I thought of my parents and I prayed, 'Oh God, help me.' And in the last minute or 2 I found my way out of the engine room. Once on the high side, I knew the nearest place out of the ship was through the boiler room air intakes. As I got there, a stoker came up from the boiler room, mad with fear, and tried to get me to go back down into the ship. Somehow I got him to help me open the hatch and pushed him up. Thankfully, he helped me up too, but I still had to shove him over the side of the ship to safety, as he was still convinced he should go the other way. Without the stoker, I would not be here. We needed each other. I was covered in oil when I was scooped to safety aboard the destroyer La Forêt. clearly a terrifying ordeal. Sadly, Joseph Hearn was not so lucky, and with 130 other souls, he rests in peace at the bottom of the sea. Eagle sank 70 nautical miles south of Cape Salinas in Majorca. 67 officers and 862 crew were picked up by the destroyers La Forêt and Lookout. U-73 was a Type 7B U-boat built at Vegasgear Werft in November 1939, and her commander, Helmut Rosenbaum, had been notably successful. This boat was responsible for the loss of 8 merchant ships and 3 warships, including Eagle. The commander received the Knight's Cross for the sinking of Eagle. The captain's transmission after the attack read, "Convoy, 15 destroyers and escort ships, 2 cruisers, 9 to 10 freighters, 1 aircraft carrier, probably 1 battleship. Fan shot at aircraft carrier. 4 hits from 500 meters distance. Loud sinking noises. Everything okay." The submarine safely evaded detection and returned to base. It would not be until December 1943 that she would finally be sunk. Despite Eagle's loss and that of 2 light cruisers and 9 merchant ships, once again the efforts of Joseph were not in vain. The remaining convoys struggled on for 4 days, with 4 of the freighters and the vital tanker Ohio the final ship to arrive. She had been heavily damaged and was strapped to 2 destroyers to keep her afloat. However, Malta was saved. I want to end our tale now by returning to the battlecruiser Repulse. As we identified, John Wynne had left her at the start of her refit in 19th of July 1941. This refit was completed around the 15th of August 1941, and the ship headed out under the command of Bill Tennant on convoy escort duty for Cape Town with a troop ship convoy WS-11. Repulse arrived in Durban on the 5th of November and then left the convoy and sailed on to Colombo, where she met up with the battleship Prince of Wales. Together with 4 destroyers, this powerful squadron formed Force Z. The key absentee was the aircraft carrier Indomitable, which had been delayed by her grounding in the Caribbean. After a brief call in Singapore, the force sailed out on the 8th of December to try and attack the Japanese troop landings taking place off the coast of Malaya. Just 2 days later, the squadron was attacked by Japanese Nell and Betty torpedo bombers. 84 aircraft based out of Saigon attacked the ships. Captain Tennant on Repulse and Admiral Phillips on board Prince of Wales both fought their ships bravely, but without any air cover, the task was futile. Repulse was hit by a torpedo that jammed her steering. 5 more torpedo hits followed, and the mighty ship rolled over onto her port side and sank by the stern. Prince of Wales was to follow her to the bottom shortly afterwards. The loss of life on Repulse and Prince of Wales was significant. Around 840 men lost their lives on the 2 ships, including 513 from Repulse. However, around 1,000 of Repulse's crew were rescued by the brave actions of the destroyer Electra. Sadly, Admiral Phillips and Captain John Leach on the Prince of Wales went down with their ship. This is what Churchill said upon receipt of the news. "I never received a more direct shock. As I turned over and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank in upon me. There were no British or American ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific, except the American survivors of Pearl Harbor, who were hastening back to California. Across the vast expanse of waters, Japan was now supreme, and we everywhere were weak and naked." The 2 wrecks are in relatively shallow water. They are sadly amongst a whole series of Allied and Axis war graves that have been looted and illegally salvaged by Chinese and Indonesian salvage vessels. Little now remains of the ships. We see here some of the images of the wreck site, showing the deterioration that took place between 2012, when the ships were nearly complete, and 2017. Demolition charges were being set by fishing vessels before salvage barges and floating cranes move in. While one culprit was apprehended and charged for the salvage of the Netherlands submarine O16, the devastation to these war graves has been truly a true tragedy. King Charles did visit Malaysia in November 2017 and raised the issue. It is hoped that what remains of these two once mighty warships will remain protected. Overall, Harry, John and Joseph can be considered to be in fine company. 253 Royal Navy vessels were lost in the First World War and 344 ships in the Second. 50,758 Royal Navy personnel lost their lives in the Second World War, with 45,000 being lost in the First. Let us end with the poem that we hear a small verse from every year, For the Fallen by Lawrence Binyon. With proud thanksgiving, a mother for her children, England mourns for her dead across the sea. Flesh of her flesh, they are, spirit of her spirit, fallen in the cause of the free. Solemn the drums thrill, death august and royal, sings sorrow up into immortal spheres. There is music in the midst of desolation, and a glory that shines upon our tears. They went with songs to the battle, they were young, straight of limb, true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end, against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. They mingle not with their laughing comrades again. They sit no more at familiar tables of home. They have no lot in our labour of the daytime. They sleep beyond England's foam. But where our desires are, and our hopes profound, felt as a wellspring that is hidden from sight, to the innermost heart of their own land they are known, as the stars are known to the night, as the stars that are bright when we are dust, moving in marches upon the heavenly plain, as the stars in the starry, in the time of our darkness, to the end, they remain. May the three of them and all their comrades rest in peace, and I hope you will join me in a moment's silence and consider what you are seeing on the screen. Once the floating home to many, a mighty instrument of war, and a war grave to all those men.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover tomorrow. Just you wait and see. There'll be love and laughter and peace ever after tomorrow, when the world is free. The shepherd will tend his sheep, the valley will bloom again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait and see. The shepherd will tend his sheep, the valley will bloom again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again. There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow, just you wait.